I came home one afternoon to find my front porch looking suspiciously bare, like someone had vacuumed my life out of the space with a leaf blower. At first I thought it was just the recycling guys being overzealous, but then my stomach dropped. The shadow box that had hung on my porch wall for years was gone. Inside that box had been my Army medals, the bronze star my father had pinned on me, and a couple of ribbons that weren't worth much to anyone but me. Gone. Vanished. Not stolen by some burglar at night. No, it was broad daylight, and my neighbor Karen was standing across the street, smug as if she had just solved a math problem no one else could understand. She had a broom in one hand and her HOA-issued clipboard in the other. I didn't need a detective to put two and two together. "Karen," I called across the cul-de-sac, keeping my voice calm, "tell me you didn't just toss out a piece of my service history." She actually had the audacity to wave her hand like she was shooing a fly. "That box was tacky," she barked back. "This neighborhood has standards. It looked like junk nailed to your house, so I had it removed." "You're welcome." My fingers twitched like they wanted to fold into fists, but I forced them into my pockets. Years in uniform had taught me discipline, but even that training couldn't stop the mix of anger and absurd disbelief rising in my chest. My neighbor had literally decided she had veto power over what memories I was allowed to keep visible on my own home. I crossed the street, my boots crunching on the pavement, and asked her as evenly as I could, "Where is it now?" She tapped her clipboard, glanced at her neat little notes, and said, "Trash pickup was this morning. If you hurry, you might catch the truck at the end of the block." The way she said it, like she was offering a helpful recipe tip, made me want to laugh and scream all at once. I turned on my heel and sprinted. Sure enough, at the corner I spotted the city sanitation crew about to dump the last of the cans. I flagged them down, explaining in rapid-fire sentences that my medals might be in one of those bins. To their credit, the guys didn't laugh. They helped me sort through 3 cans of banana peels and coffee filters until one of them pulled out the shadow box, cracked glass but intact. He handed it over gently, like he knew what it meant. That simple gesture almost undid me. When I walked back holding it, Karen was waiting with arms crossed. "You're not putting that back up," she announced, like a judge delivering sentence. "It's against HOA guidelines to have unsightly objects on exterior walls." I raised an eyebrow. "Unsightly? Lady, this is a bronze star. The Army didn't give it to me for having bad taste." She pursed her lips. "This community doesn't need military propaganda on display. It lowers property values. You should keep those things inside where no one has to see them." Her voice had that nails-on-chalkboard quality of someone convinced they're right because they said it loudly enough. I didn't bite. Instead, I said, "Tell you what. Why don't you write me up, and let's see how far your clipboard gets when the local paper runs a story about the HOA president throwing a veteran's medals into the trash." For the first time, I saw her face falter. She wasn't used to someone pushing back, let alone hinting at public humiliation. She tried to recover, snapping, "You wouldn't dare. That would embarrass the entire neighborhood." I gave her the kind of smile I used overseas when someone thought they could bluff me. "You're right. It would. And I'd enjoy every minute of it." That evening, I carefully cleaned the grime off the box and put it inside above the fireplace. It didn't feel like surrender, it felt like I was biding my time. Karen had drawn first blood, and I knew people like her couldn't stop at one strike. She'd overplay her hand sooner or later. I just had to wait and let her ego do the work. The next day, a letter from the HOA appeared in my mailbox. A formal violation notice. Improper display of personal items visible to the public. Apparently, even having the medals temporarily visible while I carried them inside was grounds for a write-up. I laughed out loud reading it, then slid it into a folder I labeled Evidence. My gut told me this story wasn't ending with a scolding. This was only the opening shot, and Karen had no idea what kind of war she'd just volunteered for. When the violation notice hit my mailbox, I knew exactly what Karen was playing at. She wasn't satisfied with humiliating me once, she wanted to establish dominance, the queen bee of a cul-de-sac that nobody asked her to rule. The irony was thick. Here I was, someone who'd served in actual combat zones, now getting harassed over a piece of wood and glass that represented a lifetime of discipline, service, and survival. Karen thought she had me boxed into a corner. What she didn't know was that I thrive in corners. Corners give you walls to lean against, and walls can be turned into leverage. The first move in this chess game wasn't going to be mine. No, I decided to wait. And sure enough, Karen came buzzing to my porch like a mosquito 2 days later. I was on the front steps with a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bike. She marched over, her HOA polo stretched tight and clipboard at the ready, as if that plastic thing gave her some kind of badge of authority. "I see you moved your little trinkets inside," she said, in that tone of false sweetness people use when they're trying to sound civil but really want to twist the knife. "Good choice. The board will be glad to know you're finally learning what community pride looks like." I sipped my coffee slowly, letting her think she had the upper hand. "Karen, you ever notice that the more you try to control people, the less control you actually have?" Her brow furrowed. She hated riddles. "I'm simply enforcing the rules. That's what the HOA exists for. Without order, this place would fall apart." She gestured toward another neighbor's lawn, where a child's inflatable pool sat near the driveway. "See? If I don't step in, we end up living in chaos. Pools in the front yard. Junk nailed to walls. Veterans trying to make their personal history everyone's problem." I raised an eyebrow at that last part but didn't flinch. "Chaos," I repeated. "I fought through actual chaos once. Trust me, Karen, yours is more like karaoke night at a retirement home." Her face reddened and I could see the storm building. That was when she played her next card. "Oh, by the way, I took the liberty of filing a complaint downtown." I tilted my head. "Downtown as in City Hall?" She smirked. "Downtown as in the police department. You left trash scattered on the curb when you dug through those bins last week. That's littering. It's technically a misdemeanor. I have photos." She waved her phone like it was Excalibur. I nearly spit my coffee out laughing. "You called the police over me retrieving my own property that you threw out? Do you hear yourself?" But she was dead serious. "The law applies to everyone. Even veterans." That line right there told me everything. It wasn't about rules, it wasn't about property values. It was about ego. She couldn't stand that I hadn't bowed my head and said thank you when she trashed something sacred to me. And because she couldn't break me with shame, she'd try with fear. I nodded slowly. "You're right, Karen. The law does apply to everyone. I'll remember that." That weekend, sure enough, a patrol car slowed in front of my house. I stepped outside before they even rang the bell. The officer rolled down his window, looking sheepish. "Sir, we got a call about possible littering on this property." I almost laughed but kept it together. "Let me guess. Woman, mid-40s, blonde, armed with a clipboard and a persecution complex?" The officer cracked a smile despite himself. "Something like that." I walked to the curb, pointed at the spotless pavement and said, "You see any litter here?" He shook his head. "Didn't think so." He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Between you and me, she's filed 6 calls this year. None of them stick. Just document everything. That's the best advice I can give." I thanked him, and as the patrol car drove off, Karen stormed out of her house like she'd been waiting for the show. She screeched across the yard, "Why didn't they ticket you?" I spread my arms. "Because, Karen, there's no crime in being cleaner than a hospital ward." She sputtered like an engine running out of oil. "We'll see about that," she snapped before stomping back inside. I made a note in my evidence folder, Incident 2. False police report. What Karen hadn't counted on was that I'd actually start making allies. Later that day, my next-door neighbor, Mr. Delgado, came over with a plate of tamales and said, "She's been harassing me too. Said my grandson's skateboard ramp is dangerous architecture. If you're keeping track of her nonsense, add me to the list. Word spread faster than I expected. Within a week, 4 households had slipped notes or texts my way, all detailing their run-ins with Karen's clipboard crusade. Suddenly, it wasn't just me with a target on my back. It was half the block. That gave me a brilliant idea. I drafted a polite but sharp letter to the HOA board. In it, I included the copies of Karen's violation notice against me, the statement from Officer Friendly about her false calls, and a list of neighbors who'd had similar experiences. I didn't send it just yet. No, timing was key. I wanted Karen to bury herself deeper before I delivered the knockout punch. She was predictable, and predictable people are easy to set traps for. Sure enough, she didn't disappoint. One evening, as I was grilling in the backyard, I heard shouting out front. I peeked through the fence slats and saw Karen dragging one of my garbage bins down the driveway. She was muttering about unapproved containers and unsanitary practices. I stepped out casually, tongs still in my hand. Karen, unless you're planning on barbecuing that bin, I suggest you leave it where it was. She froze mid-drag, caught like a raccoon in a spotlight. These bins are the wrong shade of green, she stammered. They don't match the HOA-approved model. I looked at the bin, then back at her. Karen, this is a city-issued container. Are you planning on arresting the sanitation department too? That was the first time she broke. She actually dropped the bin and stormed back to her house without a word. And that's when I knew. The tighter she gripped, the more she was slipping. I let the smell of sizzling steaks fill the air and savored the small victory. But I also knew the war wasn't over. Karen didn't retreat, she regrouped. And the more desperate she became, the bigger her mistakes would get. 2 nights later, I caught her prowling near my porch again. She was whispering to another board member, pointing toward my front window where the shadow box now hung above the fireplace. I heard her hiss, "We can argue it's visible from the street. That still counts as exterior." The other board member looked uncomfortable. "Karen, maybe let this one go. He's a vet. It looks bad." But Karen wasn't the type to let anything go. That was when it hit me. She wasn't just going to harass me with notices and trash cans. She was building a case to escalate. I didn't know how yet, but I knew the hammer she wanted to drop would be bigger than anything so far. And that, oddly enough, was exactly what I was counting on. Karen's hammer dropped sooner than I expected. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a bright orange notice taped to my door like a scarlet letter. Immediate compliance required. It read in bold at the top. According to the HOA board, I was in violation for unauthorized modifications visible from the exterior of the property. The so-called modification? My living room window. Because, according to Karen's complaint, anyone passing by on the street could see inside my home and view the medals hanging above the fireplace. It was aesthetic pollution. I had to read the notice twice just to believe my eyes. They were trying to find me for displaying something inside my own house, visible only if you squinted through a curtain slit. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. But then the anger came, sharp and clean, because I knew what this meant. Karen had turned her little vendetta into an official campaign. I walked the notice straight over to her house. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been waiting. "Finally getting with the program?" she sneered. I held up the notice. "You really filed this? Against a veteran? For hanging something inside my own home?" She crossed her arms smugly. "Rules are rules. If it can be seen from the street, it counts." The board agreed. I tilted my head. "Did they? Or did you just wave your clipboard around until they nodded to shut you up?" Her lips tightened, but she didn't deny it. "You'll pay the fine," she said firmly. "And if you don't, liens and collections will follow. Nobody is above the HOA." That was the moment I decided to stop playing defense. I wasn't going to just swat away her petty attacks anymore. No, this was going to be war, and not the kind she thought she could win with paper notices and empty threats. I started by calling the city's housing department. A polite woman on the other end told me, after a long sigh, that no HOA could enforce rules against what a resident displayed inside their home. "That's harassment," she said plainly. She even offered to send me the municipal code proving it. I printed 3 copies, highlighted the key passages, and slid one under Karen's door with a sticky note that said, "Thought you might need this for your clipboard." The next morning, I woke to find that my American flag, the one I'd raised every morning since retiring, was gone. The pole was still there, but the fabric had vanished like it had been plucked by a ghost. My stomach turned cold. I checked the yard, the bushes, even the storm drain. Nothing. That's when I noticed Karen across the street, standing by her garage with the distinct look of someone who'd just gotten away with something. She pretended to fiddle with her garden hose, but the smirk on her face gave her away. I walked straight over, calm as a surgeon. "Lose something?" I asked. She didn't even bother to deny it. "Flags aren't permitted without prior approval," she announced triumphantly. "It's in the bylaws. You can submit a request form if you want one again." My hands tightened into fists at my sides. "Karen, stealing a flag off a veteran's property isn't enforcing a bylaw. It's theft," she scoffed. "Theft? Please. I'm protecting the neighborhood from violations. You should be thanking me." Instead of blowing up, I pulled out my phone. "You're right about one thing. The law applies to everyone. Let's see what the police think." Her eyes widened, but before she could react, I dialed the non-emergency line. I explained the situation, and within half an hour, a patrol car rolled up. 2 officers stepped out. I calmly relayed what happened. Karen jumped in, waving her arms, trying to frame herself as the neighborhood savior. He had an unauthorized flag. It was deteriorating. It lowered property values. One officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, where is the flag now?" She froze. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again like a fish. "I disposed of it." "Disposed of it how?" the officer pressed. She stammered something about the trash. I stood there silently, arms folded, letting her hang herself. Finally, the younger officer said flatly, "Ma'am, you understand that interfering with personal property, especially a U.S. flag, can constitute theft. That's a criminal matter, not a neighborhood squabble." Karen turned red, then purple. "Are you seriously siding with him? He's the one breaking rules." The older officer glanced at me, then back at her. "Rules don't override state law, ma'am. If you took his property, that's theft." They asked if I wanted to press charges. For a moment, the idea of watching her get cuffed right there on her driveway was intoxicating. But I shook my head. "Not today. I just want my flag back." They ordered her to retrieve it. After a dramatic huff and a slammed garage door, she re-emerged holding the folded fabric like it was radioactive. She thrust it at me without meeting my eyes. The officers warned her that if anything like this happened again, she'd be cited. Then they drove off. That night, the neighborhood buzzed like a hornet's nest. Word spread quickly that Karen had nearly been arrested for stealing my flag. People started whispering about her at the mailbox, at the playground, at the coffee shop down the street. Mrs. Patel, 2 houses over, told me, "She's losing her grip. Even the board is embarrassed." You should see how red-faced they were when they realized she dragged them into this. But Karen wasn't done. No, humiliation only made her more dangerous. The next blow came in the form of an official HOA letter declaring that I owed $500 in fines for defiance and disorderly conduct. $500 for daring to retrieve my medals, hang them inside my own home, and fly a flag that had been there for years. The letter threatened liens, legal action, even foreclosure if I refused. It was outrageous and laughable, yet dangerous. Some HOAs really did try to pull those stunts, dragging homeowners into court until they either paid up or gave in. I wasn't about to give in. Instead, I prepared my counterstrike. I compiled every piece of evidence. The violation notices, the false police call, the officer's statements, the neighbor's complaints, and now the flag incident. I drafted a thick report, stapled and highlighted, and copied it to 3 places: the city attorney, the county sheriff's office, and, most deliciously, the local news station. I didn't send it just yet. Timing, as always, was everything. Meanwhile, I played it cool. Whenever Karen stormed by, glaring, I smiled and waved like we were old friends. Whenever she tried to bait me with a snide remark, I acted like I hadn't heard her. That infuriated her more than shouting ever could. Because people like Karen feed on conflict. Deny them that meal, and they start starving themselves. Then came the night that pushed everything over the edge. It was 2 a.m. when I heard a noise outside, a dull thud, followed by a scraping sound. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. And there she was, Karen, in slippers and a robe, dragging a heavy black trash bag from her car to my front lawn. When the beam hit her, she froze like a deer. "Karen," I said evenly, "what are you doing?" She stammered something about garbage overflow and community sanitation. But when I stepped closer and opened the bag, I found not garbage, but my flag again, shredded into strips, along with a handful of my mail that had clearly been taken from my box. The fallout from Karen's midnight stunt hit the neighborhood like a thunderclap. By 8 in the morning, the HOA board members were huddled at the end of the cul-de-sac, whispering in tense voices. By 9, a squad car was parked in Karen's driveway, its lights off but presence unmistakable. And by 10, half the neighborhood was clustered around their windows, sipping coffee with the kind of eager attention usually reserved for reality TV finales. Only this wasn't TV. This was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, caught in a scandal of her own making. I stood on my porch sipping black coffee as 2 officers escorted her down the driveway. No cuffs yet, but the image was priceless. Karen clutching her bathrobe tight, face pale as milk, jaw working furiously as she tried to spin the story in her favor. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Community standards, safety hazard, veteran propaganda. The officers weren't buying it. One of them even held up the bag I had recorded her dropping on my lawn. My phone footage had already been emailed to the precinct, and now the evidence sat in plain sight, dripping shame onto her manicured grass. When they finally left, Karen didn't strut back inside like usual. She slunk, shoulders hunched, eyes darting to the curtains she knew were full of gawkers. It was the first time I'd seen her look small. But here's the thing about people like her. Humiliation doesn't humble them. It makes them vindictive. And sure enough, that evening, I received an email blast from the HOA board, authored by none other than Karen herself. The subject line read, "Community Alert, Dangerous Resident." I clicked, and there it was, her magnum opus of slander. She claimed I had harassed her, threatened her, and even brandished weapons on multiple occasions. She warned neighbors to avoid contact with me, implying I was unstable and possibly violent. She even dragged my service record into it, writing that combat veterans sometimes struggle with civilian life and lash out unpredictably. I sat back stunned. She hadn't just crossed a line. She'd built a highway over it and charged a toll. At first, rage boiled up in my chest. She was trying to turn my neighbors against me, trying to brand me as dangerous so her own crimes would look like self-defense. But then I noticed something curious. The email hadn't come from the official HOA server. It was from Karen's personal account. That meant she hadn't cleared it with the rest of the board. She'd gone rogue, weaponizing the community mailing list for her own crusade. And that mistake was going to cost her. I forwarded the email to the board with a single sentence. "I assume you'll want to distance yourselves from this before it becomes Exhibit A in a libel case." Within an hour, the board president, a weary accountant named Harold, replied apologetically. "We did not authorize this message. Please consider it null and void. We will address this internally." That was bureaucratic code for, "Karen's in trouble," and I could practically hear her shrieking through the walls as the board chewed her out. But even as she was burning bridges with her own allies, Karen still wasn't done. The very next day, A process server knocked on my door with a manila envelope. Inside was a restraining order request. Karen had filed for a protective order against me, claiming I had stalked her, threatened her safety, and created a hostile living environment. Reading it, I actually laughed out loud. She'd spun an entire fantasy world where she was the victim and I was the villain. The irony was that, for once, her obsession with paperwork had dragged her into a system that cared about evidence. And evidence was exactly what I had. Court was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, I laid low, gathering every document, every video, every police report into a neat binder I labeled Karen vs. Reality. Neighbors began quietly checking in, offering statements of their own. Mrs. Patel wrote a notarized affidavit about how Karen had harassed her for planting roses. Mr. Delgado submitted photos of the warning notices Karen had plastered on his grandson's skateboard ramp. Even the sanitation crew, those same guys who helped me fish my medals out of the trash, wrote a note confirming I hadn't left litter behind. Piece by piece, the case built itself like a wall, brick by brick, until Karen's lies looked paper-thin in comparison. But before the court date arrived, she made one final, desperate move. One evening, I returned home to find my front yard swarming with code enforcement officers. They were measuring grass height, photographing my fence, and scribbling notes about structural compliance. I asked the lead inspector what this was about, and he sighed. Anonymous complaint. Said your property was unsafe and unsanitary. I didn't have to guess who had filed it. The inspectors quickly realized it was nonsense. My lawn was trimmed, my fence was solid, and the only thing unsafe about my property was the neighbor across the street. But the stunt backfired spectacularly. One of the inspectors, recognizing me from local veterans events, muttered, "She's been pulling this all over town. We're flagging her address for harassment complaints." I grinned. Karen had tried to weaponize the city against me, and instead, she'd gotten herself marked as a nuisance. The night before the court hearing, I barely slept. Not from nerves, more from anticipation. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every neighbor she'd bullied, every ridiculous violation notice she'd written, every ounce of misery she'd inflicted because she liked to feel powerful. When the day came, I walked into the courthouse with my binder under one arm and a calm smile on my face. Karen was already there, perched in the front row with her lawyer, wearing a navy pantsuit that strained at the seams. She shot me a glare sharp enough to peel paint. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with steel-gray hair, called the case. Karen's lawyer launched into a dramatic spiel about how I had terrorized his client, how she feared for her safety, and how my supposed aggression threatened the harmony of the community. Karen dabbed her eyes with a tissue, playing the part of the persecuted martyr. It was almost impressive, the way she committed to her performance. Then it was my turn. I opened my binder and began calmly presenting evidence. The violation notices, the false police call, the officer's statement about her wasting their time, photos of the shredded flag, the video of her sneaking onto my lawn at 2 a.m. with stolen mail, the libelous email she'd blasted to the neighborhood. One by one, I laid them before the judge like cards in a winning poker hand. The judge's eyebrows climbed higher with each exhibit. When I finished, there was a silence so heavy you could hear the ceiling fan. Finally, the judge turned to Karen. "Do you have any evidence to refute these claims?" Karen sputtered, insisting the video was doctored, the affidavits were biased, the officers were mistaken. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The judge cut her off. "Mrs. Wexler, what I see here is not a victim. What I see is a pattern of harassment, defamation, and potential criminal conduct." The morning after court, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat on my porch like nothing had happened. But there was a hum in the air, a restless vibration you could feel in the way neighbors lingered at their mailboxes or peered from behind curtains. Everyone knew Karen's empire had cracked, but nobody knew if the whole thing would collapse. That answer came around 10 a.m., when 2 unmarked cars rolled into the cul-de-sac and parked squarely in front of her house. The sight was almost anticlimactic at first. No sirens, no lights, just calm, methodical movement as 3 officers stepped out. But the way they walked, confident and precise, told me this wasn't a wellness check. This was business. Karen must have seen them through her window because the next thing I knew, her front door flew open. She charged out in leggings and a sweater, clipboard still clutched in one hand like she thought it was a shield. "You can't just show up without notice," she barked, her voice cracking. One officer calmly flashed a badge and said, "Mrs. Wexler, we have a warrant for your arrest for theft, mail tampering, and destruction of property." The cul-de-sac went silent. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-chirp. For a moment, Karen stood frozen, jaw slack, like her brain couldn't process the words. Then came the explosion. "This is harassment. This is retaliation. He did this." She jabbed a finger toward me across the street, her voice climbing in pitch. "He's manipulating you, he's dangerous, you're all being fooled." I leaned back in my chair and raised my mug in a mock toast. She noticed, and the look of pure hatred that crossed her face was almost operatic. The officers moved in, professional and unflappable. One of them gently but firmly took the clipboard from her hand. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The clipboard, her scepter of power, confiscated like contraband. When they cuffed her, the gasps from the watching neighbors were audible. Karen kicked, wailed, and even tried to collapse to the ground as though gravity itself might grant her an escape. But they lifted her easily and guided her into the back of the car. The moment the door slammed shut, the cul-de-sac erupted into whispers and hushed conversations. Mrs. Patel came jogging over, sari fluttering, a wide smile on her face. "Did you see? Finally! Justice!" Mr. Delgado leaned over his fence, grinning like he'd just watched his team score the winning touchdown. Even the kids who usually rode their bikes in sullen silence were now buzzing around in circles chanting, "Karen's going to jail! Karen's going to jail!" But the fallout wasn't just about Karen. The HOA board had been complicit in her antics, and everyone knew it. That afternoon, Harold, the weary board president, came knocking on my door with a folder under his arm. He looked 10 years older than he had at the courthouse. "We're, holding an emergency meeting tonight," he said carefully. "We'd appreciate it if you attended." I raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Damage control." He sighed. "More like survival." That evening, the community center was packed. Every seat was filled, people standing along the walls, some even recording on their phones. The board sat at the front like guilty schoolchildren, with Harold in the middle trying to keep order. He cleared his throat. "As you all know, recent events have caused disruption in our community. We acknowledge mistakes were made. Mrs. Wexler acted independently in many cases, but the board also failed to intervene. We're here tonight to discuss corrective measures." Before he could go on, voices erupted from the crowd. "You let her terrorize us for years," shouted one woman. "She fined me for having my recycling bin out 15 minutes early. She called code enforcement on my kid's lemonade stand," yelled another. The room turned into a chorus of grievances, all aimed at the board. Harold held up his hands helplessly. "Please, please, we're trying to move forward." That was when I stood up. The room quieted, all eyes turning to me. I kept my voice calm, almost conversational. "What happened to me isn't unique. Karen's behavior was extreme, but the system enabled it. The board let her run wild because it was easier than standing up to her. That ends tonight. Either this HOA starts working for the residents, or the residents will start working to dismantle the HOA." A murmur swept through the crowd. People nodded, whispered, some even clapped. Harold swallowed hard. What do you suggest?" I laid out 3 demands, plain and simple. First, nullify all fines issued by Karen in the past year. Second, implement an oversight committee made up of regular residents, not just board members, to review future violations. Third, A vote of no confidence in the current leadership, effective immediately. For a moment, the board sat in stunned silence. Then, like a wave, the crowd broke into applause and cheers. Harold tried to protest, but it was drowned out. Someone shouted, seconded. Someone else yelled, "Vote now!" Within minutes, a show of hands filled the room, nearly unanimous. The board members exchanged panicked glances, but they were finished. Their reign had ended in a single night. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Fines were rescinded, petty rules were rolled back, and the oversight committee was formed with representatives from every street. The air felt lighter, freer, like everyone had finally shaken off a weight they didn't realize they'd been carrying. Neighbors who'd once avoided each other out of fear of being reported now lingered at fences, sharing stories and laughs. Kids rode bikes without being glared at. Someone even set up a block party, complete with barbecue and music, something unheard of under Karen's regime. As for Karen herself, she faced real consequences for the first time in her life. The local paper ran a story with the headline, "HOA President Arrested for Theft, Mail Tampering." The article laid out her antics in brutal detail, painting a picture of entitlement gone unchecked. She was charged formally and released on bail, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. Rumors swirled that her husband had moved out, embarrassed beyond repair. Her house, once the pristine model of HOA snobbery, sat dark and silent, a monument to hubris. One afternoon, as I was mowing my lawn, I saw a moving truck pull up in front of her place. A crew of strangers began loading furniture while Karen hovered, pale and shrunken, barking half-hearted instructions. She caught me watching and froze, our eyes locking across the street. For the first time, there was no venom in her glare. Just exhaustion. Defeat. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, maybe an insult, maybe an apology, but nothing came. She turned away and disappeared inside. That was the last I ever saw of her. The neighborhood healed quickly after that. Without Karen's constant surveillance, people felt free to actually enjoy their homes. The flag waved proudly on my porch every morning. My medals stayed exactly where they belonged, above the fireplace, in plain sight for anyone who cared to look through the window. And instead of scowls, I got nods of respect when neighbors passed by.